a tener. Hoy tenemos a dos importantes historiadores de la historia de la ciencia. Estamos muy contentos que hayan aceptado nuestra invitación. Hoy va a presentar Paula De Vos, Remedios, compuestos en las boticas de México y más allá. Ella trabaja en el Departamento de Historia de la Universidad Estatal de San Diego. Y como comentarista vamos a tener a José Pardo-Tomás del Instituto o de la Institución Milá y Fontanals del CSIC. Pues estamos muy contentos. Les quiero también comentar, más adelante Paula lo va a explicar con mayor profundidad, pero ella prefirió en esta ocasión que su presentación sea una grabación. México en vivo y a todo color. Pues sin más preámbulo, paso a presentar. Paula De Vos es asesora del posgrado del Departamento de Historia de la Universidad Estatal de San Diego e imparte clases de historia latinoamericana, precolonial y colonial, historia de México, historia del mundo y diversos cursos de metodología a nivel de posgrado y licenciatura. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en México colonial y en la historia moderna de la ciencia y la medicina. Su libro reciente, Compound Remedies, Galenic Pharmacy from Asian and Mediterranean to the New Spain, salió ahora recientemente en el 2020. Se refiere a la historia de la farmacia, la química, la historia natural y la medicina en México colonial y otros temas, evidentemente, que ella va a desarrollar más adelante. Este libro, en gran medida, se desprende de su tesis doctoral, The Art of Pharmacy in 17th and 18th Century Mexico. Ella, pues, ha publicado una cantidad importante de artículos relacionados entre la ciencia y la política del Imperio español en revistas como Journal of Work, History, Colonial, Latin American Review, 18th Century Studies o Journals of Spain's Cultural Studies. Entre sus artículos más recientes, bueno, pues tenemos The Past and Future of the Early Modern Pharmacy History. En fin, tiene una lista importante de trabajos. De cualquier manera, nosotros los vamos a subir a nuestra página, o ya están, sí, porque Cris en eso es muy cuidadosa, para que ustedes los puedan consultar. Y sin más, daríamos ahorita inicio a la grabación.
Hello and good morning. I am Paula De Vos, and I'm going to be presenting today to you about my book, which was recently published, called Compound Remedies. But before I do that, I actually wanted to say three things. First is that, as you can see, I am speaking to you in English. I had wanted to do the presentation in Spanish, but I found that I just couldn't express the nuances and depths of my ideas as well in Spanish. And so I ultimately decided to present in English, and wanted to apologize to you because I had really wanted to do that, especially since all of the research and the reading that I did for the project, for the book, was in Spanish. So I'm sort of, translating from Spanish to English, and then presenting it to what I'm assuming is a largely Spanish-speaking audience. So I just wanted to make that point. I also wanted to explain why I am presenting as in this recording. I'm actually recording this presentation ahead of time because I have for several years now had a chronic illness that was recently diagnosed as psoriatic arthritis, which is an autoimmune disorder. And the good news is I'm in the process of getting medication for that. But the bad news is that I find it difficult sometimes, especially in the morning, to talk for long periods of time. I often have trouble breathing, and I get winded. So I wanted to do this presentation ahead of time as a backup plan, depending on how I feel in the morning for the live presentation. And finally, I wanted to thank the organizers of this session, Christina for organizing the logistics, and to Dr. Morales for being so kind and supportive and for inviting me to do this. It's very exciting for me to present to this audience. And also Dr. Pardo-Tomás for doing the comment, taking the time to do that. And both of them, and Christina also, has been very kind and supportive, and I really appreciate it. It's not easy to try to do this kind of thing when you have a chronic illness, but when people are willing to work with you and help, it's wonderful. So thank you. So today I'm going to talk about my book, as I said, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so that you can see the slides that I have prepared as well. So actually, let me go back to the first slide, and then I will put that for, oh, excuse me. Sorry, I thought it was supposed to go on the first slide. Okay, so as I said, today I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that go along, that went along with the writing of my book, as you will see. So today I'm going to talk about some of the historical and especially historiographical issues related to the writing of my book, Compound Remedies. These were issues and questions that I faced throughout the process of research and writing, and represent what I learned along the way, because Compound Remedies was certainly not the book that I originally set out to write. I began the project in the 1990s with archival research in Mexico City and Sevilla for my PhD dissertation. I originally had sought to research natural history expeditions and botanical gardens in New Spain, sponsored by the Spanish Crown. But in my initial visits to the archives, I found a document, this was in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City. I found a document that sought to tax boticarios in order to fund the Mexico City Botanical Garden established in the 18th century. I didn't know what that word, boticario, meant, and when I looked it up, I saw that it signified apothecary or pharmacist in English, something I found puzzling and interesting. In my ignorance at the time, I wasn't sure what a boticario would have to do with a botanical garden, but I wanted to find out. Thus, I set about collecting materials related to apothecaries and wrote a dissertation on the practice of pharmacy in 17th and 18th century New Spain, which outlined business practices, processes of licensing and examinations for apothecaries, inspection of apothecary shops, the visitas, and of hospital pharmacies, and the apothecary's role in public health. Of the archival documents I found, however, what most captured my interest were those containing inventories of pharmacies, some produced as a result of criminal investigations or civil lawsuits for the purpose of creating a will, or in the sequestering of materials by the Inquisition. And let me show you then the first slide here, which is an image of the inventory of the botica of Don Jacinto de Herrera in Mexico City in 1775. There on the left is the title page to the case. This was a civil lawsuit. And then to the right is the a page from the inventory. And I used that particular inventory as sort of the main example that I followed throughout the book of what was in, an apothecary shop, what were these things and why were they there. These inventories went on for pages and pages, listing hundreds of substances kept in the pharmacies, as well as equipment and books. And here I will show you then, here is a list of the different kinds of equipment or the aperos that were in this particular pharmacy. They included pots and pans, burners, ovens, spatulas, sieves, all sorts of things, bottles, tons and tons of bottles that were sort of listed in the inventory. And then here is the list of the books that were in Don Herrera's shop as well, which included some of the books that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the talk. Carried out by notaries, these inventories often took several days and amounted to several thousand pesos worth of medicines, often divided between simples and compounds. Simples being basically one kind of natural material, either plant made from plants, animals, or minerals. And then compounds were made up of a variety of simples that were mixed together and included things like ointments and syrups and things like that. For my dissertation, I was able to determine some of the most recognizable and easy to translate simples, herbs and spices still known and utilized today quite widely, including rosemary or romero, chamomile, manzanilla, cinnamon, canela, clove, clavo, nutmeg, nuez moscada, and ginger, jengibre, as well as common flowers like violets, violetas, and roses, rosas, and fruits such as oranges, naranjas, and lemons or limones. And then I took these inventories and I transcribed them and then sort of collated them as well. And here's just an example of one very minor part of Don Herrera's collection of simples in his pharmacy from 1775. These were the seeds, in fact, just some of the seeds that were listed in his inventory. And you can see that those also include some very common, still widely used and widely recognized materials, such as celery or anise, fenugreek, linseed, dill, or eneldo, sort of herbs and spices, again, that are still used today and quite widely recognized. Some of the compounds were also somewhat familiar, at least in their formulation, including syrups, pills, and ointments. I described these simples and compounds briefly in the dissertation, but didn't really understand what purposes they served as medicines, why they were there, and how they came to be in pharmacies in the first place. Additionally, there were dozens, really hundreds of simples that were not at all familiar to me, even in translation, as well as types of compounds that I had never heard of and of which I did not know how to make sense. It was clear early on as well that very few of the substances were native to New Spain or the Americas. And while there was some documentation of medicines brought to New Spain and then on to Manila in the Philippines, I found it astounding that such substances would be transported across two vast oceans or on mule trains over land as far as Chihuahua and California. I wondered to what extent the plant simples had been transplanted and cultivated in New Spain, and how and why simples were combined to form different compounded remedies, what they were, and where this whole array came from. In addition to the archival documents with pharmacy inventories were also 4 documents that included in them small bits of paper sewed into the binding of the volumes that included on them prescriptions written by apothecaries for a particular family or lists of medicines given to patients at hospitals, convents, or to prisoners of the Inquisition. And here, let me show you. This is just the title page to one of these cases that had prescriptions in it. This was a case from 1778-79 in which a boticario was providing medicines for the family of Don Bartolome Martos in Mexico City. And he was, I think, suing him because Don Bartolome had not paid him for the medicines. And then the prescriptions were used to prove, that he'd given this family all of these medicines. So this is the title page. And then these are just some photos of a few of the prescriptions. And these are photocopies from the archive that I brought home with me. And then you can see my highlighting in my notes. So I'm not writing on, on the original archival documents. These are photocopies. But here you can see these prescriptions were sort of often written as a mixture of Latin and Spanish with various abbreviations in them. So they can be kind of confusing to read. But the one on the left starts with a decoction. And the middle one starts with an extract of basically that's saffron. And I believe that says licorice, just to give you a sense. And these were given, you can see then that they're they're meant for the family or for the household of Don Bartolome Martos. And then here are just a few more that you can see. And this one you can see more clearly in the third one from the left, the third prescription. It says aceite de comer, so olive oil. So in that, they're using Spanish rather than Latin terms, or the pharmacist is. Anyway, these prescriptions, like the inventories, included hundreds, even thousands of different compounds prescribed to patients that in turn were made up of an even greater number of simples. And I went about then transcribing. So these are the 4 different cases, and I went about transcribing the lists of medicines that were included, the medicines that were included in the different prescriptions and lists of medicines. And this is just a small sort of sampling of that. These are the compounds. And then I would go about figuring out from using official formularies or pharmacopoeias, what simples then were included in these compounds as well. So what were these substances and why were they being used? To what extent did the pharmacies in Mexico reflect those in Spain? And what was the tradition to which they belonged? Why, again, were these hundreds of non-native medicinal simples being stocked in pharmacies and prescribed to patients throughout the colonial era? I also wondered to what extent the practices and the substances of the urban pharmacies in New Spain were a product of the Spanish colonial tradition, and to what extent they were influenced by local practices and local medicines of the various indigenous traditions throughout Mexico. These were the questions that I wanted to answer, and when it came time to produce a book for publication, that was what drew my attention and ultimately what I decided to work on. From work done on pharmacies in Sevilla and Valladolid, here's one example. It was clear to me that the pharmacies in New Spain closely resembled those in Spain. So this is a book on 16th century Sevilla, in which the authors made an inventory of 7 different pharmacies in Sevilla, and then again compared, collated and compared the substances as well as the books and the equipment. And they very closely resembled what I was seeing in 18th century Mexico. The same was true for official formularies or pharmacopoeias, of which this is one example, the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, or the London Pharmacopoeia. This is a 1653 edition, and again, extremely close correspondence with what I was seeing in actual pharmacies in 18th century Mexico. As I became more familiar with the official formularies that I just talked about, it also became clear that the substances in the Mexican pharmacies were quite similar to those named in official pharmacopoeias of Florence, London, Augsburg, and Paris, as well as Barcelona and many, many other cities. So clearly, this was a largely European tradition and one that did not reflect much in the way of indigenous medicines or practices from the Americas. But when I went to do basic research on that history, the works I found were often outdated or focused only on one national tradition rather than the shared pharmaceutical history that was increasingly becoming apparent to me. When I tried to get a better sense of what the simples in the pharmacies were and where they came from, I found no synthetic secondary work, and the same was true for the compounds. Some work had been done on chemical medicine, but no one had delved into what the medicines actually were or how and why they were formulated. Additionally, as I located and was able to read some of the books in the pharmacies that were listed in the pharmacy inventories, so again, this is the list of the books from the Herrera pharmacy, the towering figure of Johanna ibn Masawayh, anglicized to John Mesaway, a pseudonymic author of the 13th century, quickly became apparent. And so here's an image of Pseudo Mesaway. And the title page to 2 of his most important pharmaceutical works. But again, when I conducted what I thought would be a simple search as to his identity, again, I ran into a distinct lack of research in the field and a large amount of confusion as to his basic identity. It was clear, however, that the Arabic tradition he symbolically represented was absolutely crucial to the development of this pharmaceutical tradition. Recent works on and translations of medieval Arabic pharmaceutical texts further revealed great similarity, again, to the substances prescribed to patients in Mexico and held in Mexican pharmacies, and that this tradition, in turn, had been built upon the Greco-Roman basis for pharmacy in the works of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen, the tradition's namesake. For what I eventually realized was the Galenic tradition in pharmacy brought to New Spain's Hispanized urban culture under the Spanish Empire. Thus, I was faced with a decision. In order to understand, really understand what these substances were and how and why they were formulated as medicines, I was going to need to understand Galenic pharmacy, how it originated, and how it developed over time. And this would take me far beyond New Spain and even the Spanish Empire and far back in time. When I spoke to some US colleagues in the field about it, however, I was urged to stay in Mexico, get the book done quickly, and not delve into the, quote, rabbit hole or the unending questions that would be brought up, supposedly, by this larger project. Obviously, I did not follow that advice, and the book took several more years to write. When I began the peer review process for the book, however, I encountered some of the same critique, this time from Anglophone Europeanists who were dissatisfied by the lack of difference I had discovered between Mexican pharmacies and those of early modern Europe. They wanted to know what was different about Mexican pharmacies, and like some of my earlier colleagues, urged me to stay in colonial Mexico. Thankfully, others recognized the value and import of that approach, and the book was ultimately published. This process then brings up several historiographical and methodological issues within the field of the history of science and medicine in colonial context. I've identified 4 somewhat interrelated questions in particular that I will turn to now. So the first question is that there is a question of the extent to which colonial science and medicine, or knowledge production and discourses of nature produced within an empire, is somehow necessarily derivative of metropolitan, i.e. European, science and medicine. This goes back to the model set forth by George Basala of the, quote, dissemination of European science. Scholars have rightly challenged this, critiquing simple models of dissemination from of dissemination of European science from, quote, center to, quote, periphery, recognizing multiple centers of knowledge production and emphasizing the value and validity of indigenous epistemologies. In addition, those embracing the global turn in the history of science have urged that, like world historians who transcend traditional disciplinary fields and trace ideas and themes as they run their historical course, historians of science should also trace ideas, objects, and practices in transit, with a focus more on transmission and interaction, circulation and zones of trade, knowledge in motion, and far more crossing of traditional chronological boundaries as well. But the new models provided by the rejection of, quote, derivative colonial science and the global turn in the history of science still did not explain what I was seeing in the archival documents pertaining to pharmacies of Mexico's colonial cities. Indeed, when Galenic pharmacy was transported to the colonial cities of the Spanish Empire, it stayed largely intact, and in that way serves as a model by which to learn about a centuries-long Mediterranean tradition. While this may seem counterintuitive at first, it speaks to, I believe, a need for a different kind of conceptualization of the role of New Spain within the Spanish Empire, particularly the idea that the colonial cities, theoretically limited to the República de Españoles, were thoroughly Hispanized, highly urbanized metropolitan centers on par with any city in Spain or in Europe more generally. Mexico City in particular was a very wealthy metropolis with its own printing press, university, and medical school in the 16th century. By the 18th century, there were 34 boticas in Mexico City and 11 in Puebla and 105 throughout the viceroyalty altogether. In that sense, then, why would we expect the medical tradition brought from Spain to these cities to be derivative or, quote, different? It's time, I believe, not only to question, but to reject traditional binaries such as this. Studies on exchanges within the Atlantic world are a good start, de-emphasizing or problematizing as they do national or imperial boundaries, but I believe that we need to think even more broadly. These ideas also lead into my second question. Should I have stayed in Mexico? Should I have confined my research to New Spain during the colonial era, in other words? Those reviewers who had suggested that to me, I believe, were not prepared to think that they could learn about a centuries-old Mediterranean and later early modern European tradition from the vantage point of Mexico. They expected to learn, rather, what was different about Galenic pharmacy in Mexico. And in that way, the European experience is posited as normative, the colonial as peripheral or exotic, valuable only as a supplement to a story already known. We must continue to question and reject such assumptions, and in that way also reject allowing modern boundaries and borders, geographic, temporal, and disciplinary, to impose what seemed to me ahistorical and arbitrary limits on traditions that functioned within very different frameworks in the past. There is still the question, however, of the practical feasibility of longue durée studies that require knowledge of multiple languages and scripts, not to mention the need to read broadly in the secondary literature and understand multiple historiographical traditions. There is also the pressure to publish regularly in academia, which does not create a welcome atmosphere for studies that take many years to complete. But more collaboration among scholars across fields and time periods could be a step in the right direction, particularly leading to my third point, between Europeanists, Latin Americanists, and Arabists. Indeed, my research quickly revealed the extreme importance of the Arabic medical and pharmacological tradition for Galenic pharmacy and for the development of Western science and medicine more generally. Indeed, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates that spanned from Central Asia to the Iberian Peninsula from the 7th to the 13th century, roughly, made crucial contributions to the Western knowledge tradition, to which historians of European science often pay lip service, but without, I would argue, delving into a deeper meaning. Indeed, caliphs sponsored a massive translation enterprise of Greek and Persian medical and philosophical works, with the development of technical and theoretical vocabulary and innovative research programs and writings, with a heyday in the 8th to the 11th centuries. During this time, major classics were by revered scholars such as Avicenna, Averroes, and others were produced that built upon and extended the Greek tradition in highly significant but largely unrecognized ways. These works were then translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries in Italy and Spain, with an enormous impact on European scholasticism, theology, natural philosophy, medicine, and pharmacy, among many other fields, I should add. Early modern European medical scholars continued to utilize and revere Arabic scholarship in the early modern era, well into the 18th century, according to my research. If the impact of Arabic scholarship in medicine was so significant and pronounced, however, why is it not more widely and substantively recognized and treated by historians of science and medicine, in the Atlantic world tradition as well as the Mediterranean world? I argue that there are both intellectual and practical reasons. Intellectually, it reflects the influence of Orientalism and Orientalist constructions of East-West binaries and divisions, both a cause and a consequence of Renaissance humanism, which sought to recover original Greek works for translation that would, quote, purify them of the supposed taint of Arabic influence. The practical impacts of this intellectual tendency has meant that there is little overlap or communication between fields, and scholars of Atlantic world medicine and science do not generally learn Arabic or delve deeply into this history. In addition, there are remarkably few modern critical editions or translations of important Arabic works from this era in natural philosophy and medicine. Two glaring examples will serve to illustrate. First, Avicenna's Canons of Medicine, arguably one of the most influential writings of the Western medical tradition, consists of 5 volumes, only one of which has been translated into English in a modern critical edition, and even that is a few decades old and very hard to follow. Second, the Book of the Treasure, or the Kitab al-Tazrif by Abu Qasis, a 10th century medical scholar from Cordoba, has never been translated from the original Arabic, and there's only one modern critical edition in Arabic, despite the fact that 2 of its 30 chapters, a treatise on surgery and another on the processing of medicines, were widely read and utilized in medieval and early modern Europe. This neglect is all the more palpable when one compares this to the case for Greek works, which are widely available in multiple critical editions and in multiple languages. So finally, turning to the 4th question, there is the question that I tried to get to in the book, but did not fully succeed, I believe. And that is the extent to which Galenic pharmacy mixed or not with indigenous traditions and the ways in which it extended or not beyond the Hispanized cities of New Spain. I found that a few Native American substances, such as guayacán or palo santo, picietl or tobacco, jalap, Michoacán, copal, were regularly incorporated into Galenic pharmacy, but these constituted only a small fraction of the incredibly rich and varied pharmacopoeia of the Nahuas, the most documented indigenous tradition from central Mexico. I looked into various documentations of indigenous medicine, mainly Nahua medicine, including the Florentine Codex from books 10 and 11, the Cruz Badianas manuscript, the Relaciones Geográficas, and the Index Medicamentorum of Francisco Hernandez, and found that these sources collectively named native pharmacological substances that were native to Mexico and utilized by various indigenous traditions, but mainly, as I said, the Nahua were the best documented. They were utilizing and naming substances that numbered into the thousands. But as I documented in a subsequent article, exploring these sources to understand pre-contact Nahua materia medica presented significant methodological challenges, and not only because they were all produced within the context of the Spanish Empire and at the behest of colonial authorities. I found, in addition, that there was little to no overlap between the substances named in the different sources, and a lack of systematization of the spelling and usage of the names of different substances. Thus, although the global turn in the history of science has done well to point to asymmetries of available archival materials, and has worked to understand and recognize indigenous epistemologies, examining reciprocal impacts of, quote, old and, quote, new world, intellectual, visual, and material cultures, there is still a fundamental question about the framework within which a Western Anglophone scholar such as myself functions, and the assumptions that I brought to my research. The assumption in this case that I would find a codified overlapping list of pharmacological materials in a, quote, Nahua pharmacopoeia or Nahua pharmacology. And when I did try to make sense of my findings, it was largely within the context of Spanish imperialism, which materials became cash crops, which were incorporated into the Galenic pharmacopoeia, and which were exported to Europe. So I was that's how I sort of went about organizing and understanding them, rather than trying to understand or get at the fundamental value that these substances had within, say, Nahua communities, or how they understood these substances. These are issues that scholars must continue to think about and address if we are to understand Galenic pharmacy outside the colonial urban centers of New Spain, the Medicina Casera, written about by religious friars such as Gregorio Lopez, Agustin Farfán, or Juan de Steinefer. But luckily, scholars such as Angélica Morales are doing fine work in that area. To conclude, there are lots of exciting new directions for the field of medicine and science in colonial context, not only in terms of breaking down dichotomies of East and West, of colonial and metropolitan, of indigenous and Western, but also in disrupting usual practices by increasing breadth and depth of geography and of chronology, increasing interdisciplinary coordination among scholars in a variety of fields, and by rethinking and problematizing the very questions that we bring to our research, the way we frame our investigations in terms of boundaries, linguistic, geographic, and chronological, and in terms of conceptualizing what we consider normal practice, and perhaps upending that as well, following ideas and practices as they move throughout time and the world. That is the way that history progresses, no matter how the professionals who document it may practice. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Paula, por esta presentación. Es sumamente interesante todo el recorrido, toda la reconstrucción que haces de cómo llegas a redefinir no solo tus temas, sino la elaboración de este libro. Por supuesto, ahí está la discusión del giro global, que bueno, tenemos que discutir, y por supuesto reenfocar o recentrar, no sé cuál sería la palabra adecuada, del tema de la circulación de objetos, de prácticas, de saberes, ¿no? Con respecto no solo a la medicina náhuatl, sino en general a estos intercambios que hay con la medicina o la farmacia galénica. Bueno, y sin más, pues daría, la presentaría en este momento al doctor José Pardo-Tomás, quien es doctor en Historia por la Universidad de Valencia y desde 1994 es investigador del Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas del CSIC en la Institución Milá y Fontanals. Ha sido investigador invitado en universidades, en diversas universidades en Italia, Alemania, Francia, México, Chile y Estados Unidos. Ha dirigido varios proyectos de investigación dedicados a temas de historia cultural de la medicina y de las ciencias de los siglos XVI al XX. Ha publicado, de los cuales, bueno, pues ha publicado una docena de libros, más de un centenar de artículos en revistas especializadas y capítulos del libro. Sus líneas de investigación abarcan la historia del libro científico en la Edad Moderna, el movimiento novator, en los orígenes de la ciencia moderna en España, en los siglos XVII y XVIII, también la circulación de saberes y prácticas científicas en espacios urbanos, principalmente los teatros anatómicos, los gabinetes de curiosidades, los jardines botánicos y los museos de historia natural, y la circulación de conocimientos sobre la historia natural y materia médica americanas, tanto en Europa como en las Indias Occidentales, en especial en la Nueva España. Y sin más, doctor José Pardo-Tomás, tienes la palabra.
Gracias, Angélica. Yo debo comenzar por agradecer al quinteto itinerante, a Adriana, a Angélica, a Carlos, a Laura y a Cristina, esta nueva invitación a intervenir, esta vez como comentarista, en una sesión de este seminario, en el que desde su inicio he encontrado siempre un foro de discusión excepcional, donde se ofrece siempre mucho que pensar y mucho que aprender. Aprender, pensar y discutir. tres cosas que de nuevo ha suscitado en mí la intervención de Paula De Vos, a quien agradezco muy sinceramente el esfuerzo físico también, ¿no? Y los diversos envíos de materiales que ha ido haciéndome para la preparación del comentario desde hace unas semanas. Comienzo pues por lo de aprender y acabaré con lo de discutir, tras mucho pensar. Espero que se note, aunque quizás solo se refleje en un cierto caos, debido al estado de ideas deslavazadas de lo que voy a decir. Algunas las he escrito, fruto de la lectura de su libro, Remedios, y otras, bueno, también de la lectura de los artículos y de los documentos iniciales que Paula me pasó, y otras son necesariamente improvisadas, surgidas mientras escuchaba la intervención ahora. Una intervención cuyo tono y sentido me ha parecido especialmente sugerentes, pues ha partido de una reconstrucción tremendamente honesta del itinerario intelectual que le llevó a publicar Compound Remedies el año pasado. Que no solo un itinerario intelectual que no solo ha rehuido, sino que ha afrontado directamente insatisfacciones y cuestionamientos del propio trabajo, así como de la historiografía, o quizás sería mejor pluralizar, las historiografías con las que ha tenido que lidiar para defender un proyecto suyo, para formular sus propias preguntas y trazar una metodología también propia para formular las respuestas que ha considerado adecuadas a esos interrogantes. Mi vecino se ha puesto a hacer bricolaje justo en este momento, o sea que si sentís algún martilleo es absolutamente inoportuno, porque son las 7 de la tarde casi en España, pero le ha debido entrar ahora la gana. Bueno, voy a tratar de centrarme. Me atrae en especial la forma en la que Paula se ha situado deliberadamente en una zona crítica con el mainstream historiográfico, porque esa posición tiene sus riesgos, pero también sus compensaciones. Y es una posición que contrasta con el recurso fácil, demasiado habitual por desgracia, de discutir contra una historiografía absolutamente caduca, una especie de luchar contra molinos de viento, pero jugando con la ventaja de saber que de antemano no son gigantes, que es una estrategia que ayuda a situarse confortablemente en la zona consolidada de la historiografía de moda de turno y seguir pareciendo renovador. Obrando de ese modo, que yo calificaría de pereza intelectual, se acaba por usar un argot solo para iniciados, dando por descontado sobreentendidos que no lo son tanto, y emitiendo unos marcadores de identidad historiográfica que no resulten conflictivos para la hegemonía académica de turno. La obra de Paula De Vos, su libro, pero también toda la serie de artículos que le precedieron y lo preanunciaron, renuncia a esa actitud del recurso fácil, porque necesita plantear preguntas, por incómodas que resulten, y encontrar modos de responderlas de forma que resulten convincentes para sus lectores, pero sobre todo para ella, empezando por ella. Es importante tener en cuenta, pues, el punto de partida, tanto como el recorrido largo y complejo que le ha llevado a mantener sus actuales postulados, que no son un punto de llegada, puesto que el libro publicado el año pasado abre nuevos interrogantes y traza futuras perspectivas que será necesario abordar de modo quizá colectivo e interdisciplinar, como ella misma propone. No voy a pretender aquí resumir lo que Paula ya nos ha contado de la trayectoria que le llevó a... Perdón, voy a darle al contador. Digo que no pretendo resumir aquí la trayectoria que le llevó a escribir Compound Remedies, sino centrarme más bien en esas 4 cuestiones historiográficas y metodológicas que ha sintetizado al final de su intervención de hoy. Quiero recordar, de todos modos, algunos puntos claves de esa trayectoria. Cómo empezó por interrogarse sobre el mundo de la botica y el universo de los boticarios de finales del siglo XVIII en la Ciudad de México, y insisto en este punto de coyuntura, finales del siglo XVIII y Ciudad de México, en donde una serie de documentación le llevó a preguntarse sobre las prácticas comerciales, la regulación de las boticas, los exámenes y las visitas de boticas, el papel de los boticarios en la salud pública, y donde el hallazgo de esos inventarios, bien procedentes de procesos penales o inquisitoriales, o bien procedentes de los protocolos notariales, de los testamentos y de los inventarios post-mortem, le llevó a preguntarse fundamentalmente sobre el origen de las centenares o miles de sustancias que aparecían en esos inventarios. Y la sorpresa de encontrar orígenes mayoritariamente no americanos y que presuponían un transporte transoceánico caro y complicado del arsenal terapéutico a disposición de los habitantes de la Ciudad de México en ese momento de finales del siglo XVIII. Y preguntarse hasta qué punto, cómo y por qué esos simples y esos compuestos, de dónde procedía y de a qué tradición respondían. Hasta qué punto las boticas mexicanas reflejaban las españolas y la comparación con Sevilla y Valladolid, o con las farmacopeas oficiales de ciudades europeas como Florencia, Habsburgo, Londres o París. Este era el inicio de la trayectoria y de las preguntas. Y luego vino la decepción sobre la historiografía circulante al respecto de estos temas, ¿no? Y yo creo que buena parte de su diagnóstico es compartido. Encontrar trabajos desfasados o centrados en tradiciones nacionales, que es una escala que no tiene ningún sentido en el periodo en el que estamos hablando. O la ausencia de trabajos de síntesis, ni sobre los simples, ni sobre los compuestos, ni sobre la farmacognosia galénica, solo algunos sobre medicina y medicamentos químicos a partir de los siglos XVII y XVIII, ¿no? Y también la sorpresa y la decepción de la historiografía al encontrar el papel central de la obra de Mesue o Mesue, ¿no? Sin investigar ni siquiera su identidad confusa, ¿no? Es a lo crucial de la tradición árabe con base a la grecorromana de Hipócrates, Dioscórides y Galeno en la configuración de esa farmacia galénica de larguísima duración. Y la conclusión de ese estudio es que lo que había en esa documentación era la farmacia galénica llevada a la cultura urbana hispanizada de México. Insisto en la expresión cultura urbana hispanizada de la Nueva España. Eso daba lugar a la afirmación de que en el fondo se trataba de más de una historia farmacéutica compartida, Shared Pharmaceutical History, dice Paula en su libro, una historia realmente más compartida que enfrentada o desarrollada a espaldas de otras. Así es que esto debía ser tratado a escala global. Para De Vos, esta conclusión plantea varias cuestiones historiográficas, que son las que ahora pasaré a comentar en mi intervención, y trataré de concluir, si el tiempo me lo permite, espero que sí, con algunas cuestiones críticas. Vamos a ello, pues. Disrupt binaries, o lo que yo traduciría como romper las dicotomías, ¿no? Ese podría ser el lema común a las 4 cuestiones que nos plantea Paula. Centro, periferia o metrópoli, colonia es la primera de esas dicotomías, pero también podría ser leída como una invitación a romper dicotomías. La segunda, una propuesta de romper la dicotomía entre escala global y escala local. Y también la tercera de las cuestiones podría ser como romper la dicotomía Oriente-Occidente. E incluso la cuarta, donde en el fondo se nos propone, o quizá me gustaría pensar que eso es lo que se nos propone, romper la dicotomía indígena-foráneo. Pero vayamos a la primera de esas cuestiones. Cuestionar la dicotomía colonia-metrópoli, la dicotomía centro-periferia. ¿Hasta qué punto la medicina colonial deriva de la metropolitana? Aquí se alza inmediatamente la larga sombra o el fantasma del difusionismo que ataca de nuevo, ¿no? Y creo que Paula argumenta muy bien esa cuestión. No se trata de replantear un difusionismo absolutamente caduco, historiográficamente hablando. Se trata, sin embargo, de pensar en que hay mecanismos por los cuales la medicina metropolitana y la medicina colonial no solo dialogan, sino que se encuentran enquistadas en determinados núcleos a uno y a otro lado del Atlántico. El giro global sin duda ayuda, pero, y cito textualmente aquí, traduciendo lo que escribe Paula sobre los límites de ese giro global, porque, cito, los nuevos modelos proporcionados por el rechazo de una ciencia colonial meramente secundaria o subsidiaria, ¿no?, y el giro global en la historia de la ciencia, siguen sin explicar lo que está viendo ella en los documentos de archivo relativos a las familias, a las farmacias de las ciudades coloniales de México. De hecho, cuando la farmacia galénica fue transportada a las ciudades coloniales, acaba la cita, del Imperio Español, permaneció en gran medida intacta. Fin de la cita. De ahí deriva su afirmación sobre la necesidad de un tipo diferente de conceptualización del papel de la Nueva España dentro del Imperio Español. Y no limitarse a esperar que sea simplemente derivada o diferente. Ella lo formula con la frase México tan metropolitana o más, aunque a mí me surge la duda de hasta qué punto es la mejor manera de formular esta reconceptualización, pero entiendo lo que esa frase, ese eslogan propone, ¿no? Y así pasamos a la segunda de las cuestiones metodológicas e historiográficas, que es la de cuestionar la escala, tanto la escala nacional, ¿no?, con la que la historiografía sigue, o sobre la que la historiografía sigue obrando y proyectando hacia un pasado en donde esa escala nacional no tiene ningún sentido, y también la periodización tradicional que limita la investigación. Es decir, Paula lo que propone es un replanteamiento de las ventajas que puede tener los estudios de longue durée, de larga duración, ¿no?, y de las historias globales. Y aquí la cita es muy clara también, y abro comillas. Sigue existiendo la cuestión de la viabilidad práctica de los estudios de longue durée, una mayor colaboración entre los estudiosos de distintos campos y periodos de tiempo podría ser un paso en la dirección correcta, especialmente entre europeístas, latinoamericanistas y arabistas. Volveré sobre esta cuestión de la longue durée en la parte crítica de mi intervención al final. Pero ahora lo que interesa es que esta cita y esta propuesta de conectar con las tradiciones del arabismo y de los estudios arabistas, me parece que permite plantear esa tercera cuestión de las aportaciones árabes medievales a la tradición galénica occidental. Y en cierto modo, como apuntaba antes, eso nos llevaría a cuestionar la tercera dicotomía, la dicotomía Oriente-Occidente, hija de un orientalismo que no ha traído más que desvíos o ¿cómo se dice?, sesgos en la mirada historiográfica hacia el Oriente, ¿no? Replantear, por lo tanto, una herencia árabe también en México, en todo el mundo hispánico, a través de la medicina renacentista española. No solo Mesue o Mesué. Encuentro interesantísimo esto del peso de la farmacopea medieval árabo-musulmana en América. Aunque quizá habría que atribuir, y esta es una pequeña defensa, permítaseme, de mis autores favoritos, digo que habría que matizar la atribución de la culpa o de la responsabilidad al humanismo renacentista en el ocultamiento del peso de la erudición árabe y hebrea, por cierto, en la configuración de la farmacognosia y la terapéutica galénicas. Quizá es más culpa de la historiografía sobre el humanismo médico que de los humanistas del periodo, ¿no? La obra de Nancy Siraisi, por citar un libro emblemático ya de 1987 y que se cita en la bibliografía de Compound Remedios, abrió ya hace tiempo una crítica muy bien fundamentada en este sentido, ¿no? En el sentido de la retórica acerca de los barbarismos de la medicina árabe en la medicina renacentista europea. Llegamos así a la cuarta y última de las cuestiones que Paula nos ha planteado, la de la farmacia galénica y las tradiciones médicas y farmacéuticas indígenas en la Nueva España. O quizá el, ¿por qué no?, discutir también o acabar también o cuestionar también la dicotomía entre lo indígena y lo foráneo, especialmente a finales del siglo XVIII en la Ciudad de México. ¿En qué medida la farmacia galénica se mezcló o no con las tradiciones indígenas? ¿Y en qué formas se extendió o no más allá de esas ciudades hispanizadas de la Nueva España? Ahí nos dice Paula, no llegó el libro. No llegó el libro por determinados cuestionamientos de sus propios o de nuestros propios colegas, ¿no? Especialmente algunos referís del mundo académico norteamericano que le pedían quedarse en México y no ir más allá, ¿no? Pero lo cierto es que el resultado de su investigación y lo que incluye el capítulo 4 de Compound Remedies y también un artículo clave de 2017, anterior, por tanto, al libro, acerca de los retos metodológicos que planteaba el intento de sintetizar una farmacología náhuatl, ¿no? Prehispánica, para entender por qué y en qué sustancias, ¿no?, tenían en común esa farmacognosia terapéutica mesoamericana, ¿no? Y por qué solo unas pocas sustancias, tan pocas como porcentajes realmente mínimos, aparecían en la documentación oficial, en la documentación notarial, que reflejan los estados de materiales en las farmacias mexicanas de finales del siglo XVIII. Ella apunta que falta mucho para hacer en el terreno de la medicina doméstica y señala justamente que afortunadamente estudios como los de Angélica Morales y algún otro están haciendo un buen trabajo en ese área. Pues en eso es en lo que habría que seguir, ¿no? Y con esa voluntad es con la que paso, me quedan, sí, 6 minutos aún, paso a la tercera y última parte de mi comentario, que es la de plantear algunas dudas o algunas cuestiones que necesitan ser matizadas o replanteadas para seguir desarrollando esa ambición omnicomprensiva acerca de las culturas médicas y en concreto las farmacognosias diversas y los arsenales terapéuticos que conviven, interactúan y evolucionan en diferentes periodos y espacios geopolíticos del mundo globalizado en los primeros siglos del binomio modernidad-colonialidad. Hay que pensar bien en los límites de los resultados de la profunda y extensa indagación que el libro y los artículos de Paula De Vos reflejan y que la muy sugerente intervención de hoy problematiza desde el punto de vista historiográfico y metodológico. Digo límites de los resultados y también de las estrategias heurísticas y metodológicas que ella ha desplegado para ponerlas en práctica y encontrar pruebas que consoliden sus conclusiones acerca de las continuidades y las similitudes entre las farmacias y el arsenal de recursos materiales del mundo urbano mexicano y de los centros urbanos europeos coetáneos. Hay mucho que hacer para profundizar en esa doble propuesta de Vos. Ya ha dicho claramente romper las dicotomías. Ella propone también cuestionar fronteras disciplinares mediante una metodología multidisciplinar y un trabajo en equipo. Por eso acabaré con una serie de cuestiones que, insisto, no pretendo que Paula resuelva aquí, naturalmente, y que hago desde la ignorancia sobre muchos de los temas que su intervención toca o alumbra, pero que creo que debo hacer porque son las cuestiones que nacen de ese pensar del que hablé al principio de mi intervención sobre lo que he leído y escuchado. La primera, si se trataba de una historia farmacéutica compartida, como dice ella, Shared Pharmaceutical History, y que debía ser tratada a escala global, ¿dónde quedan las tensiones entre lo oficial y lo no oficial? Los procesos, buena parte de la documentación, nos siguen hablando de lo oficial. Nos siguen hablando, como las farmacopeas, de lo que se debía hacer, de lo que había en farmacias, en una treintena de farmacias, de oficinas de farmacias reguladas y reglamentadas. No perdemos de vista, además, con la escala global, otras escalas, incluyendo la micro. ¿No sería más adecuada una propuesta multiescala que nos llevara del mundo urbano concreto de México o de Londres o de Madrid o de Sevilla a otras escalas, incluso dentro de las propias ciudades, en otros ámbitos alejados de los barrios y las ubicaciones de las farmacias oficiales? La multiescala me parece la solución a las insatisfacciones que la propia Paula encuentra en los apologetas de la escala global. La segunda cuestión es sobre la ruptura de la dicotomía colonia-metrópoli. Me parece que es indispensable pluralizar la cultura médica europea. Tampoco ahí podemos caer en el monolitismo, en este lado del mundo. Mientras insistimos siempre en el pluralismo de los mundos no europeos, olvidamos con frecuencia la enorme pluralidad de culturas médicas existentes en Europa y en las regiones metropolitanas europeas. Integrar el pluralismo médico de la Europa metropolitana, la complejidad de las diversas culturas médicas que conviven en el seno de las ciudades europeas de los siglos XVI y XVIII, no es abolir las diferencias, pero sí es tratar simétricamente a las colonias y a las metrópolis. Y quizá una buena manera de disrumpir, ¿no? De interrumpir, de quebrar esas dicotomías. En ese sentido, la reconstrucción de la tradición galénica que hace Compound Remedios es encomiable y necesaria, absolutamente necesaria, pero debe ser constantemente puesta en relación con una realidad plural y compleja también en el lado europeo del Atlántico. Como dice la propia Paula, no es monolítica ni cerrada, pero sí está en tensión continua con otras formas de ver y entender qué curar y con qué curar los cuerpos enfermos. En las sociedades europeas, igual que en las americanas, las africanas o las asiáticas, también en las europeas. En tercer lugar, sobre lo de cambiar escalas, pero esta vez no ya geográficas o espaciales, sino cronológicas. La defensa de la longue durée es indiscutible y creo que los resultados del libro así lo avalan. Pero no se deben minimizar los riesgos de abogar por la longue durée. En especial, el de difuminar coyunturas y contextos precisos tanto geográfica como cronológicamente, donde las cosas fueron diferentes, donde tomaron caminos distintos, aunque luego se interrumpieran, durante un tiempo iban en otras direcciones y luego dejaron de ir. La teleología es el gran riesgo de la longue durée, en la que queremos acabar explicando cómo se ha llegado a unos documentos novohispanos de finales del siglo XVIII. La cuarta, y prometo, bueno, me queda poquísimo, la cuarta, sobre la importancia y la permanencia de las aportaciones árabes. No deberíamos quedarnos en la tradición erudita sobre Mesue, quien quiera que fuera el personaje, y me encanta esa búsqueda casi detectivesca de la identidad de Mesue que ha hecho Paula, o los textos de Avicena u otros. Por ejemplo, la presencia morisca en la América colonial hispánica. Un tema explorado desde hace pocos años, pero con un libro interesantísimo de Caroline Cook, Forbidden Passages, ¿no? Publicado en la Universidad de Pensilvania en 2016, ¿no? Y donde ella y otros autores están reflexionando, sacando a la luz esa presencia morisca en la América colonial. Y no olvidemos la importancia del vaquiano, ¿no? del personaje que también en la Europa, en la España con moriscos, anterior a la expulsión de los moriscos, lleva en su bagaje hierbas, medicinas y remedios curativos itinerantes, ¿no? Y la última cuestión, sobre farmacia galénica y tradiciones farmacológicas indígenas novohispanas, ¿no? Sobre la cuarta de las cuestiones y sobre el capítulo 4 del libro. Me parece fundamental la afirmación sobre lo mucho que falta aún por hacer en el terreno de la medicina doméstica y eso queda muy, muy abierto en la intervención. Pero la categoría de medicina doméstica no lo abarca todo tampoco. Como tampoco las obras de religiosos como Gregorio López, Agustín Farfán o Juan de Steinefeld, tan diferentes entre sí y producto de contextos tan distintos. ¿Qué ocurre con la farmacia académica no monolítica, pero tenazmente hegemónica de los centros urbanos de Nueva España? Cuando tiene lugar los inventarios que fueron el punto de partida de la investigación de Paula. Y aquí es donde aquel artículo de 2017 sigue vigente totalmente, porque los desafíos metodológicos que implica el intento de compilar una síntesis general acerca de la farmacopea en agua nos siguen llamando poderosamente al compromiso de llegar a eso. Acabo ya, porque no quiero abusar más de la paciencia de todos ustedes, y me he pasado ya 1 minuto y pico. Lo cierto es que no solo muchas de las preguntas de Paula en este artículo y en el libro siguen siendo preguntas abiertas, sino que sus resultados abren, por fortuna, como debe hacer toda excelente investigación, toda una serie de preguntas nuevas. La cuestión importante, a mi modo de ver, es que ahora, tras su libro, sabemos más y mejor sobre qué base podemos empezar a formular esas nuevas preguntas y a buscar respuestas más adecuadas a lo que las fuentes que ella ha exhumado nos están indicando. Gracias por la paciencia y espero que mi intervención no haya sido demasiado deslavazada. Gracias.
No, muchísimas gracias, Pepe. No, por supuesto que no. Yo creo que pones ahí los puntos en las IES y bueno, yo creo que dejas planteadas varias preguntas y sin más le daría a Paula la palabra para que responda y comento que una vez terminado esta primera ronda, bueno, también abriremos el espacio para que los asistentes, tanto en Zoom como en Facebook y en el canal del CSIC, puedan formular sus preguntas. Adelante, Paula.
Oh, gracias. If you don't mind, I'll answer in Spanish and English.
It's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
So just to say a quick response to Pepe's comment. No.
Yes,
So,
now respond for, but quick and open
okay.
Discussion for the floor.
Okay, I really think that is extremely useful, everything that you said, and it's so great to be thinking and talking about this in this session. I will say I think everything that you said makes perfect sense, and as I was thinking about it, I think that the official, not official, this city versus countryside, local, the pluralism in Mexico City itself of the different sort of medical traditions is all, these are things that just need to be explored further, and that I hadn't actually thought about the official, not official, but that's absolutely part of it. And one thing I'll just add too is when I did the research for my dissertation, it was clear that even though there were laws in place and a boticario had to have a license, a great percentage of the boticarios, even in Mexico City, were not licensed, or the widows were running the pharmacy, and they had all these reasons why, but there was an unofficial practice that was going on all the time as well, even within official pharmacy. And this is definitely a study of just what I always think of as sort of I think these pharmacies were treating only a small percentage of the population, and it's mainly, I always assumed, Spaniards, colonial officials, although you do see some evidence of people from different castas who are coming into the pharmacies, but it really is a study of that, not getting into depth of how did medicine work within various sectors of the population. It's really, I think, a more of an official study. So anyway, that's what I'll say for now, but this is excellent. And the Moriscos too, I had not thought about that. Yes. Thank you.
¿Sería todo, Paula? Pepe,
Sí.
¿tienes algún comentario?
No, podemos
¿No?
abrir
Ok,
el debate si queréis. Le agradezco mucho a Paula su comentario. Sí, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que señalaba sobre la riqueza de pensar, ¿no?, más allá de lo oficial y preguntarse también por qué existe tanta presencia de la farmacología galénica en la llamada medicina popular actual. Basta asomarse a los estudios etnofarmacológicos actuales, hechos en estudios de campo en México, y darse cuenta que buena parte de lo que allí se maneja son conceptos galénicos y son maneras de entender cómo actúan las hierbas, los remedios y los compuestos que son puramente galénicas y que están expresadas en medios sociales, rurales, alejados teóricamente de esa medicina oficial. Y sin embargo, el galenismo está ahí, ¿no? Por eso señalaba yo esa riqueza de escalas y de ámbitos, ¿no?
Y a esa medicina habrá que sumar ahora con, digamos, una nueva generación de historiadores, de antropólogos que están estudiando el tema de la presencia africana, y cada vez digamos, sería otra beta de la que menos sabemos, pero que yo esperaría que pronto haya resultados en esta línea y que nos permitan tener una visión todavía aún más densa de las plantas medicinales en estos siglos. Pues sin más, no sé, Cristina, si tienes alguna pregunta ya ¿te ha llegado alguna pregunta? El público que está en Zoom, si quisieran formular alguna, no, parece ser que hoy no.
Todavía no hay preguntas en YouTube, ni en Zoom, ni en Facebook, perdón.
Parece que hay una, lo voy a leer. Partiendo desde mi ignorancia total y pensando en la normatividad y oficialidad que reflejan los documentos, la farmacia novohispana se abrió a una serie de sustancias reprobadas y prohibidas en la institucionalidad. Pienso en sustancias como el agua de vida. Esta pregunta la hace Marcos Guadarrama.
Bueno, la pregunta es de las sustancias reprobadas.
Lo vuelvo, sustancias como el agua de vida. Sí, son reprobadas y prohibidas.
So, if I can answer in English, that's okay. That's an interesting question, and I found that there were certain substances that could provoke a miscarriage or basically an abortion for women. Those were, forbidden. There was also a debate over the use of mercury, especially in the cure of syphilis or venereal diseases. And I actually had found there was a document, it was a case in which I think it was the protomedicos were having the boticarios discuss whether or not it was appropriate to use chemical remedies. And in the end, they agreed that even though it was poisonous, it was an effective remedy. And then with the agua de vida, is that sort of like distilled alcohols, like where you're, say, distilling wine to get even more powerful sort of alcohol or spirits. That's interesting. In the Middle Ages, sort of in medieval Europe, distilled alcohol was considered a panacea, this great cure that was going to sort of miraculously cure everything. Because it had such an immediate impact on the body, they thought this was an evidence that it was really healing, just like a purgative that's going to make you, vomit. So anything that's going to show a physical result was considered to be really effective. But it's interesting. I'm thinking about this for New Spain. I don't recall prohibitions against that. And I'm trying to remember if they're in the, if they were, I don't think they were widely available in pharmacy. So maybe you know more than I do about this. No, okay. But what I know more is in the sort of 13th century, 12th, 13th century, as information about distillation comes into Europe, there were several treatises written about the healing, how alcohol could heal, but then very quickly also it starts to, there are some questions about it too, but it continues through the early modern era. But I don't know with New Spain if that was prohibited. I'm going to have to go back and look at that. I don't know if that answers the, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Ok, gracias, Paula. Público, manifiéstese, ¿alguna pregunta?
Hay dos manos levantadas.
Carlos
y José.
Hay una
Sí,
pregunta.
tenemos dos levantados la mano, yo y José.
Bueno,
Sí,
adelante,
yo hablo,
Carlos.
A ver, hago mi pregunta. Muchas gracias por ambas participaciones. Realmente se combinan muy bien para darnos un panorama muy atractivo de lo que pudo haber estado sucediendo en la transmisión o en el movimiento de los saberes farmacéuticos y botánicos y etcétera, de la farmacia galénica hacia distintas partes del planeta. Y justo mi pregunta tiene que ver porque el panorama o el diagnóstico que nos pinta la presentación de Paula, yo no he leído su libro e inmediatamente intentaré leerlo pronto porque realmente he quedado muy intrigado. El panorama que nos pinta es un panorama de una práctica muy compacta, muy de alguna manera fuerte inercia respecto a la conservación de los tipos de remedios, de los tipos de preparaciones, aunque estas se están moviendo o se están esparciendo. Entonces, inevitablemente estoy usando un lenguaje difusionista, pero justamente el tema es cómo es que en la práctica se preserva tal unidad, sí. Entonces, es un poco, me gustaría saber qué idea tiene sobre el papel, por ejemplo, que juega los libros, lo que está escrito, el papel que juega la transmisión directa de los saberes a través de una linaje de discípulos, maestros que aprenden unos de otros. Es decir, ¿qué es lo que le da esta cualidad de alguna manera de permanencia con porosidad, con posibilidad de ir incorporando, como nos dices, distintos remedios y distintos procedimientos locales? Sí, no sé, la pregunta es esa, ¿qué participa en esta inercia?
Gracias, Carlos.
I think if I understand correctly, what you're asking is how does this tradition stay so constant over time, and what's the transfer of sort of knowledge? And then where do you see sort of innovation? What I would say is that for the ancient scholars, sort of, Galen, Dioscorides, Hippocrates, they are iconic and always sort of recognized. The same with Ibn Sina or Avicenna. He is mentioned all the time. But it's really, what I found in the pharmacies was it was Mesue and Dioscorides, who were Dioscorides, the importance of his work continues, without change. So do the work of some of the other scholars, the ancient and the medieval scholars. But Mesue, I think, really takes what a lot of them are saying and makes it much clearer for the pharmacists and sort of very practical. Dioscorides is still very practical because they want the list of the materia medica. And one other major innovation, well, so that in that sense, the innovation is sort of making it clearer, explicating. But when I'm thinking about your question, a major innovation, I think, comes with the writing of a book by Luis de Oviedo, which I think is 1580 or 1581. It's first published. And his book is about how do you process medicines? How can you kind of cook your medicines or wash your medicines so that the medicinal power within it is as effective as possible? So the medicinal, they call it the virtud, the virtue. Mesue is what I argue in the book is that Mesue is the first to really start to focus on that. And then Oviedo's work in the 16th century explicates it much further. And he actually says that the ancients didn't explain this well enough. And so I'm writing this book in order to do this. That for me was one of the most important and useful books where I really started to understand the manipulation of the medicinal virtue, which then I saw, I don't know if this, which then I saw in the work of Mesue. So on the one hand, I think that there's this really strong traditional element, but then there are changes along the way. And I'll also just say quickly that it actually took me a long time to realize that this was Galenic pharmacy, because I never saw a book by Galen in any pharmacy. And it was only when I started to make a random connection between virtue and the ancient Greek concept of dunamis that I put it together. And then if anyone has ever read Galen's work, you understand why it wasn't in the pharmacy, because it's pretty disorganized. He's always angry at people, and then will, spend pages talking about why this one person was wrong. And, when you're copying manuscripts and then later publishing them, very expensive, you don't want to, you're going to use Ibn Sina or Avicenna, or especially Mesue, who's putting it together in a much more practical and shorter text that gets right to the point. And so you don't see Galen in the pharmacies really, but in the books that were in the pharmacies, they do refer to him a lot. So again, I hope that addresses what you were interested in.
Sí, gracias.
Can I add just something short? How about the personal transmission, not only the bookish? So are these pharmacists learning from teachers or?
Well, they had an apprenticeship. So a pharmacist had to be, I think it was 25. They had to do an apprenticeship with a master apothecary. And there wasn't formal schooling, at least until the late 18th century. But so they would learn it, from other pharmacists, but it was also, they had to be able to read Latin. They had to do an examination. So there was they had to be able to write. So there was some learned component of it. I have very, very few testimonies of the boticarios themselves. Like that one, the court case about the use of mercury is one of the few times when you see them, speaking at, at least in the archival documents that I was able to find. There are some Inquisition cases where they're talking, but then it's all about theological arguments and not about the medicine. One last thing I'll say is that I did see with alchemists, with the practice of alchemy or using, chemical procedures, there are several points in books that say where the author, who's a pharmacist, says, learn this from an alchemist. You can read about it for 10 years, but if you just spend a year with an alchemist watching what he does, you'll learn it much better. So that's one of the few things. Or they always also refer to the philosophers. Oh, this is an issue for the philosophers, not for us. We don't care so much about the theory, but this is the practice. But I do find a lot of theory in early pharmacy as well. So.
Ok, gracias. Pues tendrías la palabra, José.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con el origen de estos simples que utilizaban los boticarios. Se dijo que la gran mayoría de ellos eran pues plantas, minerales, incluso animales que no eran originarios de la Nueva España, por ejemplo, ¿no? Esto pues implica que hubiera un comercio fuerte atlántico de estos simples, ¿no? O no, porque, o sea, un poquito pensando en lo que sucede hoy en día, es que la mayoría de la población en México que utiliza las hierbas para curarse, utiliza hierbas europeas, pues, o del Mediterráneo, la albahaca, la hierbabuena, la manzanilla, el romero, etcétera, ¿no? Pero todas estas hierbas son plantas que se cultivan aquí en México, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta es si hay alguna evidencia de aclimatación y cultivo de estas plantas en la Nueva España y cómo la corona regulaba tanto el cultivo como el comercio de estas plantas, no sé, a lo mejor bajo la forma de estancos o cuestiones parecidas, ¿no? Ahora también otra pregunta relacionada es que si estos simples provenían principalmente de un comercio atlántico, esto elevaría mucho los precios de los medicamentos, ¿no? Esto no haría como inaccesible los medicamentos de boticario para un gran sector de la población que entonces tendría que estar curándose ya sea con hierbas locales o con hierbas aclimatadas, ¿no? Entonces, nada más. Gracias.
Those are great questions too. I will say that a chapter that didn't make it into the book was about, how do these simples get to the Americas? Or, sorry, this is when I have with my illness, my mouth gets really dry actually, so it can be hard to swallow. Anyway, so I have a chapter about that. And what I found was that many of the simples were and they were trying to transplant simples to New Spain from the very, with Columbus actually brought cuttings of various kinds of plants with him. And that a lot of the plants were successfully acclimatized in New Spain. And I looked a lot at sort of what was cultivated in gardens and missions and presidios, trying to figure this out. And there was in the, Suma de Visitas, there's evidence of, okay, how well are these things growing? And I found tons of peach orchards of orange trees, peach trees, lots of roses being cultivated. So lots of things that were part of what I would say is the Galenic pharmacy that they're trying to bring over. But there's also certainly an agricultural component to it where they serve as food as well. And that's where I think I had also noticed that in sort of modern day curandismo, even in what's now the United States, New Mexico, Arizona, it's all these Galenic or Mediterranean simples that were then transplanted to New Spain and then become appropriated by sort of the folk traditions or curanderismo that would be considered very, very, very specific to Mexico. So there's that. And then as far as prices, yes, I kept expecting that this would make, well, let me just back up. The spices, things that came from the Middle East were often not able to, or Southeast Asia, the Spice Islands, those were not easily, they couldn't transplant them. They tried, but they couldn't because the climatic conditions are so specific. And so I always expected the spices to be more expensive. But one thing I've never been able to figure out either is if you look, well, I did compare some prices for medicines, how expensive would they have been, or, especially medicines that included spices. Were they used for the poor in a poor hospital? One of the hospitals that for the documents for the prescriptions that I had was for the poor, and they would specifically say like, okay, on Tuesday, here the mulatto in bed number 7 got these medicines, and they were getting medicines with what I would have thought were the expensive spices as well. I did not see a big difference in prices. I can't quite explain. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, and one other thing I will say is that there was a tax that you had to pay a customs tax or sales tax on simples, but not compounds, because simples could be sold as commodities, whereas compounds were known to be only for as medicinal. So, and the boticarios were always complaining that they had to pay that. I think it was the alcabala. Anyway, an import, an import tax or a tax on these substances. So.
Okay. Okay. Gracias, Paula. Sandra. Sí, Sandra, perdón. Sandra.
Hi, Paula. Thank you for your chat. It's wondering to hear how, from different perspectives, you can study herbs, medicine, herbal medicine therapy in different centers. Mm-hmm. But I have a question related to the context, because my area is the study of diseases, but I think that we can study diseases or medical treatments, herbal treatments from different aspects, but at the end we need to put ourselves in the context, in the historical context that we are studying. So my main question to you is, if you have certain methods or methodology to put yourself in the context that you are studying, that will be all.
That's really interesting. I mean, one thing I would say is that I would give anything to be able to go back and experience a pharmacy like that, and the smells that must have come out, and the way that they were, the workshops must have had, you picture all these pots bubbling and, having to cut up snakes and scorpions and worms and put them with these oils and chopping these things up and putting them, that, I definitely tried to picture myself, in a pharmacy. As far as, but thinking about it from the point of view of disease, if you are sick, what do you do? If you have the resources and the money, you can go to the boticario if you want to. If you're poor, I would imagine that's not an option. Although, as I said, the medicines didn't really seem, there is some evidence that not just the españoles were going to the boticas, but if you're sick, where do you go? What do you do? And I know for my own illness, I went to, my regular, the specialists, neurologists, rheumatologists, and they found nothing. So then I did acupuncture. I go to functional medicine, all these different things, just because I want to get better. And I imagine that's what people with resources did. But I believe, and there's a book by Pablo Gomez, I'm trying to remember, Experimental Caribbean, who talks about, this medical marketplace of all these different kinds of healers. And I have no doubt that, as I said, I think that the boticas were a small, superficial layer, or just one small place where people would go to get medical care. And I think there's a whole all kinds of things going on, throughout New Spain, in the cities and the country. I think in the indigenous villages, I think they just kept healing themselves the way they always had.
Yeah.
But in the presidios and the missions, a little different, possibly in the cities, I think you're going to have a whole series of different kinds of things where people can go. And one thing I'll just say, when I was reading about the smallpox vaccine campaign in the archives, there was one story where they took a bunch of sort of indigenous children and vaccinated them. And then their mothers took the children and ran to the botica, to the closest botica, and asked the boticario to cure the children of the vaccine. That's the only mention I saw of boticario in all the vaccination records. But again, why would indigenous women go to the apothecary unless this is considered, a Spanish, a colonial affliction, the vaccine, and then you get a colonial remedy? I don't know, but I just think there's a whole history that's being written. I mean, there's Aguirre Beltran, there's certainly some really important, works done by Mexican scholars, but I think there's still more to be done. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Bueno, Aide, tienes ahora sí la palabra.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Agradecer la charla y los comentarios de Pepe Pardo, pues dan para un montón, y entonces voy a tratar de sistematizar lo que he ido apuntando, porque quizá lo primero, y va un poco encaminado con algunos de los comentarios que ya hizo Pepe Pardo, pero también lo que señalaba Carlos López Beltrán, porque me parece que, y también te lo decía ahora Sandra, en el sentido, nosotros en otro seminario con Carlos volvimos a releer, que seguramente conoces, el de cómo escribir la historia del Nuevo Mundo de Jorge Cañizares Esguerra, y es que justamente aborda, pensaría yo, este contexto más general que también lo señaló Pepe Pardo, en el sentido de que hay una transformación, una reconfiguración en España misma en el siglo XVIII, o sea, en ese, digamos, periodo un poco más enfático en el que tú has abordado, y entonces hay una reconfiguración, digamos, también en el sentido filosófico e histórico, que como tú también has señalado, Paula, quizá, o sea, había esas conexiones entre esos saberes, y eso hay ahí como un cambio. También la cuestión de la modificación, lo señala Cañizares Esguerra, en ese siglo en particular, de esta transformación de la fiabilidad de las fuentes indígenas. Entonces, ¿qué tanto pasa eso? O sea, lo que él está planteando en ese libro respecto a lo que tú estás señalando. Y luego, claro, en estas rupturas de los binomios, que a mí me parece interesante pensar desde la historia global y de la longue durée, sí, quizá más que hablar de historias globales, de historias conectadas, que también, como ya lo dijo Pepe Pardo, tienen tensiones y asimetrías, porque, digamos, se está dando ahí siempre una serie de intereses que atraviesan todas estas discusiones como en cada lugar. Y, digamos, una también cuestión, y que a lo mejor seguramente conoces, tú ahora hablabas de los scholars, o sea, digamos que trabajan ciertos temas, porque la cuestión de lo árabe, del Islam en México, ha sido muy trabajada, seguramente sí lo conoces, por un historiador, aunque digamos él no hace historia de la farmacopea ni de los remedios, y apunta más bien a una historia global, pero es Hernán Taboada. Él, digamos, es historiador, luego hizo una maestría justo en este Centro de Estudios de Medio Oriente del Colegio de México y el doctorado en estudios latinoamericanos, pero tiene pues una serie de libros sobre la sombra del Islam en la conquista de América, ya ese tiene desde el 2004. Hay otro, un orientalismo periférico, Nuestra América y el Islam, y digamos lecturas de la historia universal en la América criolla, donde justamente hay estos que es 1770, 1850, pisando un poco parte del periodo del que tú estás hablando, pero cómo ver justo esto que te marcaba quizás Sandra, este contexto donde está dándose toda una transformación, pues sí, epistémica y política, digámoslo así, ¿no? Y luego, ¿tú cómo complementarías eso a partir de todo lo que has señalado ya? Y otra pregunta, que tampoco conozco el libro, pero se antoja muchísimo leerlo, y que a lo mejor se me escapó ahora que tú estabas exponiendo, mi inglés no es así no es lo mejor, pero sí, lo decías ahora cuando hablabas de algunas cosas, pero también, digamos, ¿qué medicinas para qué corporalidades? O sea, en esto, digamos, de la discusión incluso sobre las castas, que ya está, digamos, como incluso en las pinturas de castas, etcétera, si hay esta transformación también por ahí, algún otro colega te lo preguntaba en el sentido de, digamos que no era a lo mejor, o creo que el propio Carlos, a lo mejor no era tan homogéneo, sino había esto que tú ya misma estás señalando, que en los pueblos indígenas, pues bueno, se usaba lo que había ahí, lo que ya se conocía, ¿no? Pero si tú logras distinguir qué remedios, para qué corporalidades y para qué corporalidades racializadas. Gracias.
Well, de nada, that's another really excellent question. I would say just for the medicines, what I did not find what I could see as any real difference between what would be prescribed to, say, a criollo or an español versus mulatto, morisco, castizo, mestizo. And that was surprising, but it was also because it could be because those were only, what I was looking at was charitable institutions where the state or the church is caring for these people. I think that's something to explore further, because I really don't know. I did talk about some of that in my dissertation. And also boticarios had to have limpieza de sangre. But once in a while they would make exceptions, and others could, like I think there's a case where a mestizo becomes a boticario. But I think that's something to study more. I didn't know about this book that this author that you are referring to, and I have to go. I need to get that right away, because this is my current book. I'm working on a new book project where I'm looking into the history of the dunamis versus the virtud medicinal, and looking at the history of that concept more. And I've actually started to learn Arabic. I started during the, I should say it's still going on, but the pandemic, I took classes at my university in Arabic because I could do it over Zoom. And I just thought, if I want to really read these things, I need to know the language, at least to some extent. So I'm really interested in that. And then as far as the 18th century, I think that, if I understand, you're saying, like, especially the late 18th century with the Enlightenment, with the Bourbon reforms. I mean, there's major reorganization of a society going on. I did not, as far as Galenic concepts, and the four humors, the qualities, to explain disease, that doesn't seem to change much. Again, people studying more disease and the body will know more than me about that, but from the point of view of pharmacy and the way they're explaining things, I mean, the Stein affair it's all humors. I mean, it's there. I mean, that part doesn't seem to change. What I did find, and what I wrote about for my dissertation, was lots of reforms and changes to the protomedicato, which was the medical board that oversaw, all of the official medical professions. And the Crown, I'm trying to think, the Crown was trying to dissolve it. In fact, abolished it several times. And then during the wars of, the independence, then it is reinstated, then it's abolished. And I actually have a chapter on that for the book that I never made it either. It was too long. And I need to go back anyway, but that's where I found the most changes. But I will say for pharmacy, probably the most important part of that was that they take a work by Felix Palacios, the Palestra Farmacéutica, which was first published in 1706 in Madrid. That becomes basically the official pharmacopoeia that the boticarios are supposed to follow. And when you have a visita, you would take that and say, okay, you need to have this, all of these medicines, and they had to fill prescriptions, make medicines according to that book. And then it comes out as the pharmacopoeia, what is it? I'm trying to remember, Matritense and Hispana. Those are, that it becomes sort of, and they reorganize it and it changes, but that's the first time that you see an official formulary for the boticarios. The Protomedicato was going to do that in like 1593. I think they have a law saying we're going to make an official list of medicines they have to have, but then it never happens until really, I think it's like the 1720s. Yeah, somewhere around there. But as far as it was interesting, the Bourbon reforms didn't seem to affect practice from what I could tell very much, but it also could just be lack of kind of documents too. So,
yeah. Muy bien, Paula, gracias. Bueno, la última pregunta que tengo acá es de Idalia García. Ella pregunta, dice, Paula mencionó algunos, lo leo, Paula. Paula mencionó algunos inventarios de libros y ella dijo que estos se integraron serán incluidos más tarde. ¿Podrías ahondar más en esto? Pregunta Idalia García.
So the books in the pharmacy, sort of what was found there?
Supongo que sí.
Actually, this kind of relates to the 18th century. So the inventories I had were only from the 18th century. The prescriptions, I have an Inquisition document from 1592, and then several prescription lists from the 17th century. So that was good, but the inventories were all 18th century. And they did have, and I don't talk about this in the book, or I didn't talk about it today. There were a number of books of surgery, and I do talk about this in the book. A number of works on chemical medicines, but for the most part, the boticarios seem to rely on Mesue, the book by Oviedo, Dioscorides, but in the the new translations by Mattiolo or Laguna. I did find, so those were considered sort of the traditional books that I think they always followed, but they did show a significant amount of, how can I say this, like the books in the pharmacy showed that they were keeping up with innovations, especially in surgery. There's a number of surgical books. Were they doing some surgeries? It's hard to know. Sometimes surgical books will have a lot about medicines in them. but they also were very open to chemical techniques and chemical medicines as well. And that goes against, I think it was Alan Debus wrote an article at one point about how Paracelsus and chemical medicines, they, Spain didn't pay any attention to that for, a century. It comes late. I didn't find that at all. I actually think that from my experience, what's going on in Spain and in New Spain is they're very open to using chemical techniques. And as early, the earliest inventory I had was 1725, and there's a distilling apparatus there, an alembic. So they're distilling medicines. So that, I think that's what I would say, that you see tradition. I mean, in the sense of Mezoe is really what they always are referring to. Mezoe is well into the 18th century. But there's also, as I said, like innovation going on too, in terms of the works that they had in the pharmacies. And that's where I began, when I started to write the book rather than the dissertation. At that stage, it was about 7 or 8 years later, that's when you could get the digitized books on Google, and I could download dozens of pharmacy books that I would have had to go to the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid or in Mexico City to be able to just look at. Now I could download them, print them, and it was amazing. And so it was only when I started to be able to track down and get these books that were kept in the pharmacies that I started to really see the Arabic foundations of this whole tradition. I mean, the Greco-Roman tradition, foundations, which I expected, but then the Arabic foundations too. So, yeah.
Muchas gracias, Paula. Bueno, ya no veo ninguna mano levantada, creo. Dejen nada más checar, creo que ya no hay ninguna pregunta. Y para no abusar de ti, Paula, ¿no? Porque sé lo pesado que puede resultar estar respondiendo.
Oh.
¿No? Pues bueno, no me restaría más que agradecer, por supuesto, tu participación en esta charla, por supuesto los comentarios de Pepe y de todos los asistentes. Creo que ha sido una sesión muy rica, muy interesante. Están ahí planteados muchísimas preguntas y líneas de exploración que tenemos. Yo creo que este tipo de sesiones revitaliza enormemente este campo de la medicina y en particular del estudio de las plantas y la farmacia galénica y por supuesto de las plantas de la medicina náhuatl. Y ya, si me permiten, solo haría un anuncio muy importante. Ya nuestra última reunión del Seminario de Itinerantes está convocada para el día 6 de diciembre. Va a ser una sesión híbrida, se va a realizar en el CSIC, en la UNAM. Tenemos como invitada a Colly Hayden. Ella nos va a presentar una charla sobre el genérico espectacular, los medicamentos y la semipolítica en México. Los comentarios en esta sesión van a estar a cargo de Yetro Hernández Barrones, así que pues no se lo pierdan, será nuestra última reunión del año de itinerantes. Y también les queremos avisar que en enero, bueno, tendrán también los resultados, bueno, nos tenemos que poner a trabajar sobre la convocatoria para el 2023, ¿no? Las de las presentaciones que se van a ir realizando el año que entra. Y sin más, pues les mando un abrazo a todos. Muchísimas gracias, Paula, de nuevo, Pepe, por estar aquí en esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias
Gracias a todos, a todas.
Chao.
Hasta luego.
Adiós.
Chao, Paula.
Gracias.